I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter in my trembling hands. The official notice from my bank made my chest tighten. The funds I had set aside for my medical treatment funds I had carefully saved over the years to manage my chronic illness had been redirected, and not to any emergency account or medical provider. The money had gone straight to Clara, my son, Ethan's wife. My throat tightened, and I felt a hollow ache in my stomach. I couldn't believe it at first. I double-checked the numbers, the account details, every signature. It was all real. My treatment fund, the security I had relied on for decades, had been diverted without my consent. I thought of my upcoming appointments, the prescriptions I could barely afford, and the tests I had been postponing to make ends meet. This money was meant to keep me alive, to keep me healthy enough to continue living independently. And yet, it had vanished in favor of my daughter-in-law's career ambitions. I dialed Ethan's number, my hands shaking. When he answered, his tone was cheerful, almost casual, as if nothing was wrong. "Mom." "Hey, what's up?" I could hear Clara in the background, laughing at something trivial. I swallowed hard. "Ethan, the bank my treatment fund. It's gone. It's been transferred to Clara's account." "Why?" There was a pause, a faint rustle, and then his voice, carefully measured. "Mom, you know how important this is for Clara. Her promotion, the relocation, it all required extra funds. We thought you'd understand." Understand, I wanted to scream. Understand that my life, my health, my very well-being had been considered secondary to a career advancement that had nothing to do with me. I felt my hands clench into fists, knuckles white. I had spent 60 years giving, caring, sacrificing, raising a son who now seemed to believe that my welfare was negotiable, contingent on someone else's desires. The betrayal settled over me like a cold, suffocating fog. I wanted to cry, to shake him, to demand justice. But my voice faltered. All I could do was sit there, stunned, my heart hammering in disbelief and hurt. The realization struck me fully: the people I had trusted the most had placed someone else above me, and I had no one to turn to in that moment. I hung up the phone and stared at the counter, trying to steady my breath. I knew something had to change. I could no longer allow this to happen. Not again. And yet, I had to figure out how. That night, I began to consider my options, thinking through every possibility, every ally I had, every step I could take to reclaim what was rightfully mine. The first glimmer of resolve was faint, but unmistakable. A spark that would guide me toward the decision that could alter my life forever. I remembered the long years when my body felt like it was working against me. The chronic illness had been part of my life for decades. Subtle at first, then growing in intensity. There were mornings when I woke dizzy, my muscles stiff and uncooperative, and I relied on the routine I had built for myself. Medications taken at precise times, doctor appointments carefully scheduled, and a diet that supported my fragile health. But over time, even those small routines became a source of stress. Ethan, once attentive in his youth, gradually stopped checking in. He forgot appointments, arrived late when I needed a ride, and sometimes I would sit in the waiting room, silently hoping he would appear. Clara, with her busy career and ambitious plans, rarely acknowledged the strain I was under. Phone calls went unanswered. My reminders brushed off, and the careful plan I had constructed to maintain my independence began to unravel. It wasn't just the big things. Even small inequities gnawed at me. When groceries were purchased, Clara's preferences seemed to dominate, while my dietary restrictions were ignored. If there was a financial decision to make, it was always her needs that took priority. I learned to swallow my pride, to rearrange my life around theirs, even as my health quietly suffered. These experiences eroded my confidence, little by little. I began to question myself, wondering if my needs were unreasonable, if I was asking too much simply to be cared for in my time of vulnerability. The favoritism was subtle at times, a prioritized expense here, a delayed prescription there, but cumulative enough to make me feel invisible in my own home. I realized then that this was not just neglect. It was a pattern that had been allowed to continue for years, and I could no longer ignore it. I needed to find support elsewhere. Someone who would see me as more than a background figure in their lives. I began thinking of my Aunt Lillian and Uncle Marcus, the only relatives who had ever shown genuine concern for me, and wondered if I could reach out to them to find the strength and guidance I needed. That thought led me to consider the first step toward reclaiming control over my life, and toward the decision that would change everything. The pattern of favoritism became impossible to ignore. Every holiday, every birthday, every minor achievement of Clara's seemed to eclipse my own needs. Gifts, trips, and celebrations arrived for her without hesitation, while I was left to manage on my own. When Ethan received a bonus at work, a portion went immediately to fund Clara's professional development, while my medical appointments and prescriptions were delayed, pushed to the back burner as though they were optional. Even ordinary days highlighted the disparity. Meals were prepared with Clara's preferences in mind, while I had to make do with whatever was left over or rely on takeout I could barely afford. Clothing, household purchases, even small conveniences favored her. I watched from the sidelines, swallowing the bitterness that rose each time I realized my well-being was secondary. The emotional toll was heavier than any financial neglect. I tried to speak up, carefully choosing my words, attempting to explain that my treatment and care mattered too, but my voice was dismissed or ignored. Ethan, caught between loyalty to his wife and filial duty, often chose the easier path, placating Clara and minimizing my concerns. Each time I asked for a minor adjustment or support, the answer was a polite but firm deflection, leaving me frustrated and isolated. It was in those quiet moments, sitting alone at the table with the evidence of yet another ignored need in front of me, that I realized how deeply I had been sidelined. The favoritism was deliberate, sustained, and unchallenged, and it had eroded not only my confidence, but my sense of worth. I could no longer pretend that this was oversight or misunderstanding. Acknowledging the inequity was painful, but it also stirred a quiet determination inside me. I began to see that if I wanted to preserve my health and dignity, I would need to find allies and support outside the household. Someone who would treat me with the respect and care I deserved. I thought of my Aunt Lillian and Uncle Marcus, who had always been willing to listen and offer guidance, and I knew that reaching out to them would be the first step toward reclaiming control. I decided to reach out to Aunt Lillian and Uncle Marcus in Chicago, hoping they could offer the guidance and support I so desperately needed. Their response was immediate, warm, and unwavering. Within days, I found myself driving through familiar streets, the anticipation of seeing them stirring a cautious hope in my chest. Once I arrived, the comfort of their home was palpable. They listened without judgment as I explained the situation with Ethan and Clara, acknowledging the frustration and hurt I had carried for years. Aunt Lillian reminded me that my health and dignity were not negotiable, while Uncle Marcus offered practical advice on managing my finances and safeguarding my medical funds. Their support felt like a lifeline, steadying me as I began to consider choices I had long avoided. In the weeks that followed, I started taking small steps toward independence. I scheduled my own appointments, confirmed prescriptions, and began managing day-to-day finances without relying on Ethan. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of control over my life. however tentative. Each small decision reinforced my confidence, and I discovered that asserting my needs did not have to feel confrontational. It could simply be an act of self-respect. Even simple routines became empowering. Planning meals, organizing my schedule, and making calls I had previously deferred allowed me to reclaim a sense of agency I had long forgotten. With Aunt Lillian and Uncle Marcus offering guidance but not interference, I felt the beginnings of a new rhythm, one in which I was responsible for my own well-being. It was clear that if I wanted lasting change, I would need to make definitive choices about the boundaries I set with Ethan and Clara, and the first step was building the strength to act on them. Over the following weeks, I spent hours reflecting on everything that had happened. The more I considered the patterns of favoritism, neglect, and disregard for my well-being, the clearer it became that my health and dignity had been repeatedly compromised. Ethan had always been torn between loyalty to me and devotion to Clara. But in practice, he consistently chose her priorities over mine. I realized that no amount of explanation, pleading, or compromise would change that. The love I had for my son weighed heavily on me. I had raised him, supported him, and believed in his potential. But love alone could not justify sacrificing my own safety and independence. I remembered the frustration, the appointments missed, the medical bills unpaid, and the subtle ways I had been sidelined. It had all added up over decades, leaving me depleted and invisible in my own life. One afternoon, I called Ethan, determined to address the matter directly. He answered in his usual upbeat tone. Oblivious to the storm of emotion within me, I explained calmly and clearly that I would no longer allow him or Clara to control the funds meant for my treatment, that I could no longer depend on them for support, and that I intended to manage my affairs independently. I watched his voice waver over the phone as he tried to reason with me, to appeal to my maternal instincts, to remind me of the past and his intentions. I listened without interruption, acknowledging his words but holding firm. When he hesitated, expecting me to relent, I remained silent long enough for him to realize that my decision was final. I would not be swayed by guilt or nostalgia. I told him with quiet resolve that I valued our relationship, but only under terms that respected my boundaries, and that until such respect was possible, I would limit our contact. When I hung up the phone, I felt an unfamiliar weight lift from my shoulders. The choice had not been easy, but it was necessary. For the first time in years, I recognized my own power, my own worth, and the possibility of a life defined by my needs rather than the demands of others. With this resolve, I began to consider the next steps, how to rebuild my life fully, without interference, while protecting the peace I had fought to reclaim. After making the decision to limit contact with Ethan and Clara, I turned my attention to rebuilding my life on my own terms. The first step was reclaiming my health. I adhered strictly to my medication schedule, resumed gentle exercise, and committed to regular checkups, ensuring that my body was supported and my illness managed. Each small improvement reinforced my confidence and reminded me that I could take care of myself. I also began reconnecting with friends I had drifted away from over the years. Luncheons, book clubs, and casual walks through the neighborhood reminded me of a world beyond the confines of my son's household. Their encouragement was comforting, and their presence a reminder that I was valued for who I was, not for the role I played in someone else's life. Volunteering became another source of fulfillment. I spent afternoons at a local community center, helping organize events and supporting other seniors with their needs. The work was rewarding, and it gave me purpose beyond the daily concerns of my own health and finances. I discovered that giving back could coexist with self-care, and that independence did not mean isolation. financial management remained a challenge. Handling bills, insurance, and unexpected expenses without Ethan's assistance was daunting at first. Minor setbacks, a delayed insurance reimbursement, a misfiled medical claim tested my patience and resilience. Each time I navigated these obstacles successfully, I felt a quiet pride, knowing that I could rely on my own judgment and resourcefulness. Hobbies I had once abandoned came back into my life. Painting, gardening, and journaling offered not only enjoyment, but also a way to process my emotions and reflect on my journey. These simple acts of creation became acts of empowerment. Each brushstroke and plant nurtured, reinforcing the notion that my life could be fulfilling on my own terms. As the weeks turned into months, I began to feel a sense of stability I had not experienced in years. My independence was no longer fragile. It was tangible, grounded in consistent action and self-respect. I knew that the next step would involve confronting lingering challenges with Ethan. But for now, I embraced the life I had begun to rebuild, strengthened by the knowledge that I was capable of standing alone. One afternoon, as I returned from a routine appointment, I found Ethan waiting on my porch. His expression was careful, measured, almost pleading. "Mom," he began, his voice soft. "I know things have been difficult. I never meant for you to feel abandoned. Clara and we just wanted the best for everyone." I listened quietly, letting his words hang in the air. I had expected this moment, though not necessarily on my terms. The familiar tug of maternal instinct rose within me, the part of me that wanted to believe he still cared. But I had spent the past months reclaiming my independence, and I knew that old patterns could not dictate my present. "I understand your intentions, Ethan," I replied evenly, meeting his gaze. "But your actions have consequences. For decades, I've been sidelined, ignored, and left to navigate my illness and finances on my own. That cannot continue, regardless of your explanations." He shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the street as if expecting neighbors to intervene. "I'm sorry, Mom. I thought I was doing the right thing. I never meant to hurt you. I appreciate your apology," I said calmly. "But it does not change the past. I am choosing to protect myself now, and that means setting boundaries. My health, my well-being, and my dignity come first. You can respect that, or we will maintain distance until you do." He opened his mouth, paused, and then nodded reluctantly. There was no argument, no attempt to override my decision this time. I could see the conflict in his eyes, guilt mingled with frustration, but I remained unmoved. A neighbor from across the street peeked through the curtains, curiosity etched across their face. I ignored the watchful eyes, focusing instead on the clarity that had come from months of reflection. For the first time in years, I felt completely in control of my own life, and I knew this encounter, though tense, was a confirmation of my growth. The following weeks would bring new challenges, but I felt ready to face them, knowing I had the strength to stand firm. 10 years had passed since I had firmly set my boundaries with Ethan and Clara. In that time, I had built a life defined by my own decisions, my own health, and my own well-being. I had settled into a rhythm that offered stability, independence, and a sense of purpose I had never experienced while living under their influence. One morning, as I sipped my coffee and reviewed my mail, a notice from the local authorities caught my attention. It mentioned Clara Hayes and a legal matter requiring immediate attention, including police involvement. My heart skipped a beat as the weight of years and unresolved tension pressed in. The name I had long avoided, the person who had indirectly caused me so much frustration and neglect, was suddenly thrust back into my life in a way I could not ignore. I took a deep breath and began preparing myself. I reviewed my records, ensuring that all documents related to my finances, medical history, and past communications with Ethan and Clara were organized and accessible. I consulted a lawyer I trusted to confirm that my decisions over the years were legally sound and that I could confidently assert my independence without fear of repercussion. The anticipation was almost tangible. I went through the steps I had rehearsed mentally, imagining the interaction, how I would maintain composure, and how I would respond if questions or accusations arose. My resolve, hardened over a decade of self-sufficiency, allowed me to approach the situation with clarity rather than panic. By the time the police arrived at my door, I was ready. The years of preparation, reflection, and personal growth had strengthened me, and I knew I could face this confrontation without compromising the independence I had fought so hard to secure. The moment was imminent, and I opened the door, feeling the culmination of 10 years of resilience guiding me through what was about to unfold. The knock at my door was firm, authoritative, and impossible to ignore. I opened it to find 2 uniformed officers standing on my porch, their expressions neutral but professional. Behind them, I recognized the faces of Ethan and Clara, both stiff with tension and uncertainty. I took a deep breath, steadying my voice. "I understand why you're here," I began, "and I am prepared to provide any information you need. All actions I've taken over the past 10 years have been documented and legally sound. I have records of my finances, my medical care, and my communications regarding my independence." Ethan's jaw tightened, and Clara's eyes darted nervously. I could see the realization dawn on them. They had not accounted for the consequences of their favoritism, the ways their choices had ignored my rights and needs. I continued, calmly but firmly, for years. My treatment fund was misused, and my health was disregarded. I have spent this decade ensuring my well-being without relying on anyone who would prioritize themselves over me. Today is the culmination of those efforts. My independence is protected by law, and my rights will not be compromised. The officers listened as I laid out the facts succinctly, clarifying each step I had taken to safeguard my resources and assert my autonomy. Ethan attempted to speak, to interject explanations and apologies, but I maintained control of the narrative, ensuring that the truth of their neglect was clear. As the conversation progressed, the officers acknowledged the pattern of favoritism and financial misconduct. Ethan and Clara were confronted with the reality of their choices, and it was evident that the weight of responsibility had finally settled on them. I felt a quiet sense of vindication, a validation of years of careful planning, resilience, and courage. The confrontation had exposed the truth, and I could finally allow myself to move forward, knowing that the boundaries I had set and the life I had built were respected and protected. The resolution opened the path for the final reflection on what these 10 years had taught me and how I would carry this strength into the future. Sitting in my sunlit kitchen, I reflected on the past decade and the journey that had brought me here. My health was steady, my medical needs fully managed, and my independence firmly established. The years of careful planning, difficult choices, and persistent self-advocacy had culminated in a life that I controlled entirely. Ethan and Clara remained in my life only peripherally, their contact limited and carefully defined by the boundaries I had enforced. The tension of the past had eased, replaced by a sense of peace I had never known while dependent on their goodwill. Friends and family who had supported me over the years remained constants, providing warmth, companionship, and reassurance. I thought of the lessons I had learned that self-respect must never be compromised, that boundaries are essential for preserving dignity, and that love alone is not always sufficient to maintain a relationship. Protecting oneself is not selfish. It is necessary. The justice I had sought, validation of my choices and recognition of my autonomy, was finally secured. As I looked around my home, Filled with evidence of the life I had rebuilt, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The hardships, the betrayals, and the struggles had shaped me into someone resilient and self-assured. I had reclaimed not just my health, but my life, on terms that honored my worth. The decade behind me had closed, and ahead lay a future defined by my choices and the freedom I had fought to achieve.